Can everybody now see my screen? Yeah, and if I move on to the next slide, can you see that?
We are seeing it as your PowerPoint slide. So if you want to sort of start it as a slideshow, that probably be work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
And if I move on, you can see that it's moved on.
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. Well, good evening. Good evening again, everybody. And it's lovely to be back with you virtually. And thank you for being so forbearing with my cold last week. I realised it was suboptimal. But anyway, so this evening we are looking at the Henrician Church, which you'll notice I haven't called the Henrician Reformation. And some of the reasoning for that might become clear as we talk. But key themes for this evening that we're going to explore will be about the King's Great Matter and how that led to breaking with Rome. We'll look amidst other things at the dissolution of the monasteries and some key features of Henry VIII's church. And we'll keep coming back to that question that I raised last week about what sort of church the church in England was at various points and what sort of church the Henrician Church was. Because if you look at an older book about the Reformation, so this handy little seminar study published in 1989, The English Reformation 1530 to 1570, you might have a story that gives you an idea that the Reformation happened during Henry VIII's reign. And in a sense, the story we're going to tell is that it did. That in the course of Henry VIII's reign, England went from being part of Western Catholic Europe to being an independent church with the king as the head, and features that might lead us to think that it might be heading towards Protestantism. But in other regards, there's no way in which you could possibly describe the Henrician Church of England as Protestant. So some of that's what we'll explore this evening. And then we'll look ahead. We'll look ahead to what we'll call next, what we'll talk about next week. But, oh, sorry, if you're just joining, could you make sure you're on mute, please? Thank you. We'll look ahead to next week and to where the church was heading by the time Henry VIII died in 1547. And we'll come back to some of the questions that we raised. If you remember last week, we had that map of Europe and we noted the importance of the Habsburgs in the dynastic politics of Europe. And we'll see how that played in to some of what we look at this evening. We'll see how that wider dynastic European context, and particularly the pressure on the Tudor monarchy to secure the succession, all played into how it came about that by the time of Henry VIII's death, there was a Church of England of which the king was the supreme head. So there we have Henry VIII as painted by Hans Holbein in 1537. And Henry VIII had come to the throne in 1509. He was the younger son of Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who had taken the throne in battle at Bosworth in 1485, ending that period of dynastic conflict that we tend to call the Wars of the Roses. So Henry VIII was the younger son of Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York. And Henry's elder brother Arthur, who would have succeeded to the throne, died. Arthur had been married first, or betrothed at any rate, to Catherine of Aragon. And after Arthur's death, Henry was then married to Catherine. This became hugely significant in the ways in which the debates about breaking with Rome played out. But what's particularly important to note about Catherine of Aragon is that she was the aunt of Charles V, the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor. She was the representation of the Habsburg dynastic interest in England. So in the 1520s, when there were huge diplomatic negotiations going on to annul the marriage to Catherine of Aragon, that Habsburg interest and that wider political, dynastic and conflict scene that we looked at last week comes into play in a big way. It mattered who it was Henry was trying to get a divorce from. And then, as we know, if we know anything about Henry VIII, we know that he had 6 wives who were divorced, beheaded, died. So Catherine and Jane, and then divorced, Anne of Cleves, beheaded again, Catherine Howard, and then Catherine Parr, who survived him, who outlived him, dying in 1548. And all these successive marriages were about one thing. They were about securing the succession. So Catherine had just one surviving child. She had a number of pregnancies, but only one surviving child, who was Mary, who was born in 1516. By the mid-1520s, certainly by the late 1520s, Henry was much interested in Anne Boleyn. And when he finally came to marry her, she too had one surviving child, Elizabeth, born in 1533. After he had duly beheaded Anne Boleyn in 1536 and then married Jane Seymour, she again had one surviving child, Edward, the male heir for which Henry had longed for so long, but she died in following the birth of Edward. None of the remaining 3 wives had any children by Henry. So we can come back to that at various points. But the key things to remember about all this sort of divorced, beheaded, died stuff in this particular context is that it's about securing the succession. It's about securing the future of the Tudor monarchy. And Henry came in the course of the 1520s to think very much of the fact that he had not got a legitimate male heir. He had one illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, but that he hadn't got a legitimate male heir was a sign of divine punishment, and he came to understand it as evidence that his first marriage, certainly that to Catherine of Aragon, was disapproved of by God, and that's why he hadn't got the son he needed for the Tudor succession. So we'll come back to Henry and his marital exploits at various points through this evening. But as you may remember from what I said last week, Henry VIII very much saw himself as part of Renaissance Europe. He was very much seeing himself in the model of a humanist prince. He and Francis I, the King of France, had met at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, and he very much self-fashioned as a scholar, as a musician, but as a loyal son of the church. And in the immediate response to Luther's protest, Henry had drafted a defense of the 7 sacraments, and that's where he gets the title that the monarch today still holds of Defender of the Faith, and he was thrilled to get his papal title. He was absolutely delighted to have this recognition. And so even after the break with Rome, he holds on to this title of Defender of the Faith. But it's really important as we start to think about the shape, the trajectory, and the development of the Henrician Reformation, to remember that Henry had started as a staunch defender of the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith in the face of Luther's protests. There was no inevitability at all in the 1520s about the future shape of the English Church under Henry. And as we'll come back to at various points this evening, what became clear was that Henry's church, Henry's Reformation, if we might want to call it that, was certainly in no wise straightforwardly Protestant. Some key figures who we're going to meet in the course of this evening are a collection of Thomases, all of whom played a very significant role at one stage or another, some of them through the long haul, in the shape of the Henrician Church. So first of all is Thomas Cardinal Wolsey, the Archbishop of York, and it was Thomas Wolsey who was Henry's chief diplomat. It was he who negotiated the Field of the Cloth of Gold, and it was he who, in the 1520s, was heading up the diplomatic efforts to get the marriage from Catherine of Aragon annulled. So he headed up a team of scholars and diplomats who went off across Europe on behalf of the king to seek the support that would be needed, primarily from the Pope, for the annulment of the Aragon marriage. When that all fell to pieces, that whole diplomatic effort collapsed in the wake of 1527, when the imperial Habsburg armies sacked Rome. And they took the Pope prisoner, and it was really clear at that point that there was no way that diplomatic efforts that worked against Habsburg interests were going to come to any sort of fruition. And Wolsey fell from favour very quickly in the late 1520s, and then he died. So, you know, what would have been his fate had he not died of illness? Who knows? But it's very significant that in the midst of the developing rhetoric of English evangelicalism, as you remember, I called it last week, in the developing rhetoric of English evangelicalism, criticism of Wolsey as a prelate for abuse of ecclesiastical officers, they start to form part of the rhetoric, but they're certainly not part of what causes, certainly from the king's point of view, his fall. His fall is because of the failure of diplomacy and the realization that there's no way that the plan to annul the marriage to Catherine of Aragon is going to work. And Henry's absolute desperation to marry Anne Boleyn, to have an heir, secure the succession, and to move on in that way, because he has become convinced by the late 1520s that the marriage, so-called marriage as he starts to think of it, to Catherine of Aragon was not a marriage on the basis that she had previously been married to his brother Arthur. So that's Thomas Wolsey. The second Thomas is Thomas More. Thomas More, if you're a reader of Wolf Hall, is not terribly sympathetically portrayed. In other literature, he has been made, it's been hagiography. He has been, I've lost the word. He's been made almost as though he's a saint. Thomas More was layman. He was a humanist scholar, really significant humanist scholar in England, good friends with Erasmus, and he was, as I say, Chancellor of the Exchequer. He is executed for his refusal to swear to take the oath swearing to the Royal Supremacy. And that is really significant. More's consistent refusal to recognise the king as head of the church is a sort of turning point in the 1530s, and a turning point in the way in which the church in the 1530s develops, partly because of the way in which Thomas More had been, although a humanist scholar, so determined to pursue heresy. So that points to the ways in which we can't draw a simple line between humanism, humanist scholarship, and impulses to Protestant reform. So that's our second Thomas. Our third Thomas is Thomas Cromwell, hero of the Wolf Hall trilogy. Sorry, my printer's making noises behind me. And Thomas Cromwell, another layman. Thomas Cromwell had started his career in the household of Thomas Woolsey, and he will meet Cromwell a lot during the course of what we talk about the 1530s. Cromwell also falls from favour and is executed in 1540, and he's executed largely because of the way in which faction politics swings following the failure of the marriage to Anne of Cleves, marriage number 4. And then our last Thomas is Cranmer, Cambridge scholar, Archbishop of Canterbury, becomes Archbishop of Canterbury after the death of Wareham, and extraordinarily manages to survive the whole of Henry's reign. It is astonishing that Cranmer survives, because through all of the religious vicissitudes, the conservative backlash, as historians have tended to see it, in the latter part of the reign, from 1539 through to 1547, Cranmer is there. And more than that, Cranmer has got married. Now, Henry VIII never at any point allows for clerical marriage, but Cranmer has married the niece of a German theologian while he's been off on diplomatic efforts through Europe. Somehow Cranmer survives, and the importance of Cranmer for what follows we'll explore later on this evening. I'm going to pause for a moment before we start to think about the actual mechanics of the break with Rome. So you may remember that one of the questions that I raised last week as how we think about the English Reformation is whether we think about it as a top-down Reformation or a bottom-up Reformation. Is this something that's primarily elite or primarily popular? And certainly in the earliest part of the formal Reformation in England, the break with Rome, it's arguable that what we're effectively seeing is a legislative, parliamentary Reformation. You may remember that I said that I pointed out that in England before the 1520s, 1530s, Parliament didn't routinely sit. Parliament was called when the king needed to raise taxes, and the king primarily needed to raise taxes when he wanted to go to war. But in 1529, Parliament is called to deal with the king's great matter, the fact that he needs to end the marriage to Catherine of Aragon to secure the succession. That is a huge change in English constitutional history, let alone our religious history. What happens then is a series of pieces of legislation that bit by bit take apart the relationship with between the English Church and the wider Western Catholic Church, that sever the link with Rome. And it's done quite piecemeal. So the first key piece of legislation in 1532 is a conditional act in restraint of annates. Now, annates are papal taxes, effectively. And so what this does is it limits the ways in which the church can tax, and taxes can be paid to Rome. That's followed in 1534 by a further act in restraint of annates, which gives the king the power to tax the church. So that's a significant change. 1533 is the most important in many ways piece of legislation, which is the Act in Restraint of Appeals. And we'll come to the preamble to that in a moment, the very famous preamble to that. But what the Act in Restraint of Appeals does is it prevents English clergy from appealing to Rome. You can only appeal instead to the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that effectively breaks Roman jurisdiction over the English Church. But all of this hasn't changed anything that's going on in any English parish. The church, the liturgy still looks the same, you still do the same, all those things that we pointed to as features of popular religion in late medieval England, it's all still the same. Nothing has changed at popular level. as a result of any of these legislative changes. 1534, the Act of Supremacy. That does, to some degree, change a tiny aspect of English parish religion. But what the Act of Supremacy does is it makes the king the supreme head of the Church of England. And it's on the back of that Act of Supremacy that is required the oath that Thomas More refuses to swear to, that John Fisher refuses to agree to, various other people refuse to agree to. And so that becomes treason. It becomes treason to refuse to accept the king as head of the church. And in the midst of all this, Thomas Cromwell gets a government post. He gets called Vicegerent in Spirituals, which is effectively Secretary of State for Religious Affairs. This is extraordinary. As part of a parliamentary reformation, a legislative administrative break with Rome, a layman who's got no theological education or training is given this huge power over many, many aspects of the life of the English church. And this is going alongside the power held by the Archbishop, particularly the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is, of course, by now Thomas Cranmer. The Act in Restraint of Appeals is really interesting. It, as I say, prevents English clergy from appealing to Rome, breaks the jurisdiction link between the English church and Rome. But its preamble is as follows. And this becomes, in a sense, the sort of ideological basis for the Henrician Reformation. And it's worth pausing for a moment and thinking about it. So in the preamble, it reads, where by divers sundry old authentic histories and chronicles, it is manifestly declared that this realm of England is an empire, and so hath been accepted in the world, governed by one supreme head and king, having the dignity and royal estate of the imperial crown of the same, unto whom a body politic of all sorts and degrees of people, divided in terms and by names of spirituality and temporality, be bounden and owe to bear next to God a natural and humble obedience. So what is there to say about that? This is the preamble to breaking with Rome. In the midst of it, this is against the background of breaks with Rome that have been happening all across Europe on the basis of a theological rhetoric that tells us that in the case of Luther, that the Pope is Antichrist, that the church has been held under a Babylonian captivity. None of this do we find in the preamble here. What we find instead is a historic argument, an underpinning that says this realm of England is an empire and only owes allegiance to one place, and that is the monarch. So it's an argument that works completely differently and makes basically no theological comment about the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, his status at all. It simply says he just doesn't have jurisdiction here because of the nature of the realm of England. So these are hugely innovative claims about national identity and national self-determination. And this is the basis on which England, the English church, breaks with Rome. I'm just going to pause for a moment and see if anybody's got anything they want to pick up at this stage before we move on to some pictures. Could you stick it in the chat or stick a hand up or something? No. Oh, Chris May.
Yes, you said at the start that Catherine of Aragon was either betrothed or married to Arthur.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not aware of the different inflections of what those two words meant in the 16th century, but it strikes me as quite important to know, well, were Arthur and Catherine married or not? And therefore, what's really going on?
Okay,
to give a bit further clarity to what is actually going on.
Okay, Thank you. That's a perfectly reasonable question. So Catherine thinks they're married, but the claim is that, and the claim that she continues to make is that the marriage was never consummated. Henry, through the 1520s, simply refuses to believe this, and in a really undignified way, the question about what happened in this teenage marriage bed some significant time before becomes a huge cause of the, part of the public debate about the ending of this marriage in a, really unkind way. Broadly speaking, in the 16th century, people took the view that if a marriage wasn't consummated, it wasn't a marriage, and therefore it could be annulled. It could be as though it had never happened.
So it wasn't just I pronounce you man and wife, and you're legally married, you've signed a register, and so you can't get divorced.
There were no marriage registers.
Right, okay. But that's just sort of trying to get a feel for what's going on. Okay.
So the whole question, and to some extent, starts to pivots around what, were they married, and if so, what was the nature of that marriage? Henry is determined that they were, and that it is because in Leviticus it says that a man may not marry his deceased brother's wife. It is because of that he genuinely comes to believe, I think, that that's why he hasn't got a legitimate son, because God is punishing him for this thing he shouldn't have done in transgressing divine commandment, in marrying his deceased brother's wife, because he genuinely believes, I think, in the 1520s that Catherine and Arthur were properly married, and for that reason he then comes to doubt or to question the authority of the Pope to have granted the dispensation by which he was able to marry his deceased brother's wife. So his logic goes, Arthur and Catherine were married. I haven't got a son. This is because God is punishing me. God is punishing me because Leviticus says I can't marry my deceased brother's wife, which is what I've done. The Pope has said that I can, but I still don't have a son. Therefore, God is still punishing me. Therefore, the Pope doesn't have the authority to overturn that commandment. Does that clarify it? Thanks. Any more for any more? Okay. In which case, what we do have, however, by the early 1530s, certainly by the mid 1530s, is an English church that is no longer part of the Western Catholic Church, no longer under the hegemony of Rome, in which you can't appeal to the Pope can't tax the English church, and in which there is a growing amount of space, as we've just seen actually in some of the answer to that question, to question the place of papal authority and of the traditional teachings of the church. Now, as you'll remember from last week, perhaps, one of the things that we said was that in much of Europe, there was no issue about scripture in the vernacular. But in England, there really was, because of the legislative inheritance from Lollardy, from the 14th century translations by John Wycliffe, and by the ways in which that heresy as the medieval church saw it anyway, had been suppressed in England. Now, that is not to draw a connection between Lollardy and the early English Reformation. That's a huge historiographical debate. I think it's reasonable to say that there are certain commonalities between Lollardy, between the 14th century practice, and it persisted in some places. It's very hard to demonstrate cause and effect, but be that as it may. As well as trade and wool and people going backwards and forwards across the Channel to continental Europe, ideas were starting to go backwards and forwards across the Channel in to continental Europe. The first evidence of Lutheran writing in England is in 1520. So very early, there's Luther's work in England. It's very clear that in the late 1520s, Lutheran ideas were being circulated at court, including with the circle that was around Anne Boleyn. Nobody's saying she was a Lutheran, but that evangelical reformist idea is part of the air people are breathing, certainly at court. It's certainly there in Oxford and Cambridge, and there are certainly connections between key figures, including Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, with reformist ideas and movements on the continent. In the midst of all of this, there is growing pressure for an English Bible. And the first translation in the 16th century of the Bible in English is by William Tyndale, translates the New Testament and some of the Old, and goes into exile. He is executed in Antwerp in 1536. Certainly he had been persecuted by Thomas More, though whether to the extent that Hilary Mantel thought he had is a different question. But the pressure for the English Bible is not at all letting up. And the first complete English Bible is translated by Miles Coverdale, though an awful lot of it is building on Tyndale's work. It's first published in Antwerp in 1535, and then is published in England in 1537, and it's actually dedicated to Henry. There is the Matthew Bible, which is published, produced by Rogers, who's an associate of Coverdale's. And then in 1539, which we'll come to later, there is the Great Bible. And the injunctions of 1538, which we'll come to shortly, demand that these copies of this are placed in parish churches. It's then published again in 1540 for private reading. Henry doesn't at all like the idea of people reading the Bible for themselves, but it is 1540, there are copies printed for private reading, and by 1541, more than 9,000 copies of it had been printed. So that's a huge print run in the context of the mid-16th century in England. The picture we've got here is 1540 version of it. It's in the British Library, and it's the printed title page, hand coloured. It's probably Henry VIII's own copy. And if you can see, there's Henry VIII on his throne at the top, handing the Bible to the bishops. And you can see various people in it, and they're all busy shouting Vivat Rex, God save the King, down at the bottom. So here we've got a very, very clear statement of what the king's role in the church. And the king's role in the church is that the king, as God's appointed and anointed person, who is the head of the church, to whom people owe spiritual and temporal obedience, it is he who is giving his subjects access to the words of Scripture. In all of the conservative backlash, if you might call it that, of the 1540s, there's no effort to rescind the Bible in English. So one of the things that maintains from the 1530s into the 1540s is the availability and access to, increasing access to, the vernacular Bible. And that becomes very significant. Everybody's still worshipping in Latin. Nothing's changed in that regard, but every parish church is meant to have a copy of the Bible in English. People have access to it at home and in increasing numbers. And that essentially does a significant thing. What that does is it completely undercuts the whole idea that to read the Bible in English is somehow heretical or transgressive or against the Catholic faith, the same Catholic faith that Henry had very, very determinedly defended and asserted, and which is, until the late 1530s, still the official position theologically of the Church in England. The other thing we tend to know about Henry VIII and his Reformation is that monasteries were dissolved, leaving, in Shakespeare's phrase, bare ruined choirs. Here we've got the bare ruined choirs of Tintern Abbey and Monmouthshire. This largely happens as an initiative of Thomas Cromwell's. And it's worth pausing to think about what it's really about. One of the things that it's very definitely about is about combating what is seen to be a superstitious practice of pilgrimages, but particularly pilgrimages to Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury. The Becket shrine at Canterbury is dismantled, and the reason for that is clear, because Becket had stood up against King Henry II for the rights of the church and had stood against the king. So Becket, who'd been a huge devotion to Becket across late medieval Europe, but Becket had exemplified the power of the church as separate from that of the king. And so it's totally unsurprising that the Becket shrine at Canterbury should be dismantled. And it's important also to see the dissolutions of the monasteries as part of Henry's attempt to assert the royal supremacy. He is said to have described the clergy as, yea, our subjects, but half our subjects. And that's particularly true when he looked at the religious, because you can restrain clerical appeals to Rome, but members of religious orders didn't owe their primary allegiance to Rome in the same way. They were part of international religious orders whose mother houses were in France, at Citeaux, at Cleugh, and they were part of a European network where there was no allegiance owed, in that sense, to Henry as head of the church. So the dissolution of the monasteries happens in two waves. In 1536, the smaller houses, those that are worth less than £200 a year, are dissolved. And that happens more or less without opposition. There are a number of reasons for that. The smaller houses tend to be less powerful, and they tend to belong to less powerful international orders. They're also disproportionately houses, female houses, convents. And I think it's worth considering the 1536 dissolutions as a kind of trial run or experiment for what follows in 1538 with the dissolution of the greater houses. Cromwell and his court of augmentations, his commissioners, have proved they can do this, and they do it remarkably easily. One of the things that follows from this, though, is that you've got lots of ex-religious who are supposed to do what? For the male members of religious houses, it was comparatively easy. Many were ordained, so they could take posts as priests in places, or they could go into houses as chaplains and as tutors. What the women were supposed to do is less clear, because you weren't free to marry if you'd taken a vow of chastity, even if your religious house had been dissolved. The king was very clear about that. So lots of women ended up going back to their families who may or may not have wanted them. And a number clearly continued to live in community with their sister religious, despite that the religious houses have been dissolved. 1538, there is the dissolution of the greater houses. These are the houses that are wealthy, they're worth more than £200 a year. There is some opposition to this, but of all the religious houses in England, only the abbots of 3 are executed for refusal to to comply with the dissolutions, which is tiny. It's tiny in the context. There is opposition to the dissolutions in Lincolnshire in the north, in a series of uprisings that tend to be known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, under the leadership of a chap called Robert Aske. Series of uprisings. They raised the Five Wounds banner, Five Wounds of Christ, and also the Cuthbert banner from Durham. That rebellion is broadly suppressed very quickly, but it does point to something about the conservatism and the resilience of traditional religion in the north, which we see again, and we'll see again when we come to look at Elizabeth's reign. This is all facilitated through a thing called the Court of Augmentations. The Court of Augmentations is responsible for the ways in which the resources of the monastic houses are accrued to the Crown. It's really clear that from all this, there are a number of things going on with what might happen to the finances. Thomas Cromwell, who very definitely had evangelical reforming sympathies, saw this as the basis for building an English commonwealth, for improving the commonweal. Henry saw it as a very good way of enriching the crown, and much of the money that was accrued from the dissolutions gets spent on war with France in the 1540s. It also means that the crown acquires huge patronage very quickly. And so think about all those Tudor and Jacobean houses that are all called something or other abbey, and lots of old abbey lands that go to reward loyal royal servants and subjects and the nobility of England. It's noticeable, as we'll see next week when we come to look at Mary Tudor, that when the religious houses are re-established under Mary, nobody's very keen to hand their land back. Even very, very determined Catholic nobility are not keen to return the land that they'd acquired as a result of the dissolutions. The social effects of the dissolutions are significant. As we noted last week, the role of the monasteries and the social fabric of late medieval and early modern England have been significant in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, as employment, and as providing hospitality to travellers, all kinds of things. And loads of that just collapses more or less overnight as the religious houses are dissolved. People who look at literacy levels can see a significant drop in literacy levels among the generation of children who would have gone to school in the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the monasteries and the dissolving of the monastic schools. So one of the things that happens under Edward VI, as we'll see next week, is a foundation of a load of schools. And there are still Edward VI grammar schools in various places around the country. And those are founded, no small part, to make good that deficit that has been observed because of the removal of monastic education from the general English common life. But what was the theological character of this church? So we've got a church where people are still worshipping in Latin, using the Latin Mass. We've got a church where the king, not the Pope, is the supreme head. We've got a church where by 1540, the English Bible's pretty readily accessible and is authorised. We've got a church where the monasteries and all that they represent in traditional religious practice have gone. But what's the theological character of this church? What sort of church are we looking at? And a series of four documents for publications which might help us think about this. The first is the 10 Articles, which are approved by the bishops in 1536 as Articles of Faith of the Church of England, and owe quite a lot to negotiations with the Lutheran Schmalkaldic League. They are in some ways quite Lutheran in favour. And they're divided into two parts. The first 5 are articles that relate to doctrine. And they are that the scriptures and the 3 creeds are the basis and summary of true Christian faith, that baptism conveys remission of sins and regenerating grace of the Holy Spirit, and is absolutely necessary as well for children as adults. So that is a clear, has clearly in its sights the challenge posed by Anabaptists who call into question infant baptism as unscriptural. Thirdly, that penance consists of contrition, confession, and reformation, and is necessary to salvation. So we've got sacramental penance upheld, as it is in early Lutheranism. Fourthly, that the body and blood of Christ are really present in the elements of the Eucharist.
Yes.
What it doesn't say is that there's only one understanding of Eucharistic presence. We'll come back to that in a minute as we look at the 6 articles. So that leaves a bit of Lutheran space, if you like, for different understandings of Eucharistic theology. That justification is remission of sin and reconciliation to God by the merits of Christ, but good works are necessary. We're not going as far as justification by faith alone. So those are the 5 articles related to doctrine. Then there are 5 related to ceremonies. Images are useful as remembrances, but are not objects of worship. So images are okay. Can keep them, can't worship them. And that's the Lutheran position. That saints are to be honoured as examples of life and as furthering our prayers. That saints may be invoked as intercessors and their holy days observed. Communion of saints is fine. That ceremonies are to be observed for the sake of their mystical signification and as conducive to devotion. Ceremonies are okay. And that prayers for the dead are good and useful, but the efficacy of papal pardon and of soul masses offered at certain localities is negative. So prayers for the dead are fine, but the Pope can't grant indulgences, and there's no particular merit in saying a soul mass in certain places rather than other places. So there's quite a lot of reforming space in those 10 articles, and those form the basis for the injunctions of the late 1530s and on which the English Bible is authorised. But they're certainly not a thoroughgoing statement of Protestant, Lutheran, Reformed, any version of confessional Protestant doctrine, but there's definitely space there. And these form the basis for what is commonly known as the Bishop's Book, which is published in 1537, which never receives royal authority. But then what happens is the court politics changes. So Anne Boleyn has fallen, Henry has married Jane Seymour, finally gets this longed for son and heir, and then Jane dies in childbed fever, which is very common in the early modern period. And there's a period of negotiation about what happens next. And Cromwell negotiates a diplomatic marriage with Anne of Cleves. Dukes of Cleves are Lutheran. The Cleves marriage does not go very well. It lasts 6 months. They get on all right when they're not married, and Anne stays in England for the rest of her life, receiving a pension as the king's beloved sister. But as a marriage, it doesn't work at all. And the factional politics of the court changes, so there's a significant conservative backlash. And in 1539, there is a statute of 6 articles of religion passed. Now, this has a legal force that the 10 articles did not have. This is in statute and can be prosecuted and punished in law. The reformers at Henry's court, the reformers among the bishops, are absolutely aghast by this and call it the whip with 6 cords. It's called an act for abolishing diversity of opinions. So this is an interesting sort of anticipation of what we see later about the emphasis on uniformity of opinion in the English Church. But what these 6 articles uphold, bearing in mind what I just said about the 10 articles, so the first one upholds absolutely clearly, crystal clear transubstantiation. In the most blessed sacrament of the altar, by the strength and efficacy of Christ's mighty word, it being spoken by the priest, is present really, under the form of bread and wine, the natural body and blood of our Saviour Jesus Christ, conceived of the Virgin Mary, and that after the consecration there remaineth no substance of bread and wine, nor any other substance but the substance of Christ, God and man. That space that we saw in the Eucharistic article in 1536 has gone. It's narrowed down very clearly to traditional teaching about transubstantiation. Secondly, communion in both kinds is not necessary. Thirdly, that priests after ordination may not marry as afore, that vows of chastity must be upheld, that private masses can be continued, and upholding sixthly, auricular confession as expedient and necessary. So it's very conservative, and that sets the flavour for the final years of Henry's church. So what sort of church are we looking at? And the picture you've got in the middle, the one that's handwritten in the middle, that's a late draft of those 6 articles, and they seem to be in Henry VIII's own hand. It's in the British Library. And this forms a sort of basis for 1543 published a book called The Necessary Doctrine and Erudition for Any Christian Man, to set forth by the King's Majesty of England. And it's popularly known as the King's Book. And that too is a very conservative, traditional statement of doctrine, which upholds all the things like prayer for the dead and soul masses, and gives a sense that this is in many, many ways a traditional church. This is not a church that is, certainly in the mind of Henry VIII, part of the Reformation. He does not see the fact of the break with Rome as indicating that he is now head of a Protestant church. So what sort of church was the Henrician church? Was it Lutheranism without the key doctrine of justification by faith? Was it Lutheranism in the sense that all kinds of aspects of traditional practice, and particularly the authority of the Pope, had been called into question, but which never makes the theological commitments that Luther makes and everything that follows from that? Or was it effectively Catholicism without the Pope? A traditional church, I've just lost the book. A traditional church in which everything stays as it was, except papal authority. Well, no, it's not that either, because the monasteries have gone, the Bible is available in English, all kinds of aspects of traditional religion have been undercut or called into question. And then, despite the very Catholic, conservative flavour of the final years of Henry's reign, his final wife, Catherine Parr, who has in many ways a lot of influence on what follows, is certainly interested in evangelical reform. She it is who persuades Henry that his daughters should be restored to the succession. So she it is who is responsible for the fact that after Edward's death, first there is a Catholic Mary, and second there is Elizabeth, who becomes Supreme Governor of the Protestant Church of England. And the ground is well laid for a Protestant future. So we'll see next week, there's no reason at all to suppose that Edward wouldn't have grown up and secured the succession, and that a Protestant Church of England might have followed. Edward was being brought up by his largely, certainly evangelical reforming Seymour relatives, his godfathers, Thomas Cranmer, and everything feels like it's headed towards a Protestant future, despite the traditional feeling of the latter part of Henry's reign. And Peter Marshall has summarised this really rather beautifully in his Heretics and Believers, which I pointed to last week. So, if I may, if Henry divided his people, he also unwittingly helped emancipate them. With the destructive abolition of old pieties, and in the absence of coherent or compelling alternatives emanating from the Crown, increasing numbers of English people were taking responsibility for their own understanding of religious truth, helping to forge the new Christianities that would transform the face of the nation. Death came for Henry on the 28th of January 1547. His own spiritual testament was as ambiguous as the religious course he had charted for his country. The will stipulated burial in the choir of St. George's, Windsor, where an altar was to be furnished for 2 priests to say daily masses for him while the world shall endure. There were to be 4 solemn annual obits, and at the funeral 1,000 marks for distribution to paupers, with instructions to pray for Henry's soul. All this from the monarch whose King's Book insisted that there was no certainty how or if individual suffrages might benefit the dead. Henry's will expressed confidence in salvation through his fulfilment of such good deeds and charitable works as Scripture commands. But at the very end he called for Cranmer, who performed for him no priestly rites or sacraments. He merely urged the king to ask for Christ's mercy and to give some token that he trusted in the Lord. Henry squeezed Cranmer's hand as hard as he could, and shortly after departed. So what sort of church did Henry leave? A Catholic one? A Protestant one? If a Protestant one, one sort of Protestant one? And what was set up for the future? Next week, we'll look at Edward and Mary, at questions of Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and of the mid-Tudor crisis. And we'll keep coming back to that question of what sort of church was the Church of England. I've got, again, and maybe if we can circulate this list, because I've got assorted bits of suggested reading. Trouble is, most people who write books about the English Reformation write very big, heavy books. But pointing again to Peter Marshall's Heretics and Believers and Duffy's Stripping of the Altars, to Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, written by Dermot McCulloch, 20 odd years apart, 2 absolutely phenomenal studies of the English Church, not just as biographies of Cranmer and Cromwell, but as studies of Tudor England and of the nature of religion in England, of the place of England in the European context. There's a nice little book, which is now older than I thought it was. It was published in 2002, which is a collection of essays about the beginnings of English Protestantism. And as I said, one of the things about particularly Hilary Mantel's novels is that they've inspired any number of really good articles in the Sundays, online, and all the rest of it about the Henrician Church. So a quick Google search of Cromwell or Cranmer or anybody will find you some really good stuff available online. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm aware that I've talked for slightly longer than I did last week. If anybody has got any questions or comments in the chat, and now is your moment.
I wonder what you think Henry thought as he's lying on his deathbed as to what the future of the church in England would be?
It's tempting, I think, to see that account of the sort of squeezing Cranmer's hand. And, you know, Edward's education had been very much entrusted to Cranmer and to the Seymours. And Henry must have known, must have been under no illusions. And I mean, you know, Cranmer, as I say, survives through all of this, despite the really punitive factional politics of the 1540s. Henry must have known he had got a wife living there. He must have known. There's no way he could have not known that. And I shouldn't think it occurred to Henry that either of his daughters would ever succeed to his throne. As we'll see next week, the flavour of Edward's church was very clearly very different for a rather short time. But there's been, there's a historiography that says that poor little Edward was a sickly little boy who was going to die anyway. Everybody was absolutely astonished when he died in his early teens because he wasn't at all a sickly little boy. And although infant mortality was very high in the 16th century, if you survived infancy, you were pretty likely to survive into adulthood. So who knows?
Thank you.
There's an argument that basically the only real thing that Henry definitely believed in was the royal supremacy. But if you think of that Holbein portrait, again, it's that question about, I think it raises some interesting questions about sort of self-fashioning. What image is Henry wanting to portray of himself in the church and all the rest of it. David.
Yes, how do we account for Cranmer's survival, especially as the views he's certainly espoused when Edward came along were becoming increasingly unfashionable?
Maybe Henry liked him. It's really hard to account for just how, just how he survived. And I mean, I think there's an interesting question, which is how much when Henry died, how much was it like kind of releasing a pressure valve, and lots of things that people had just not been saying for a very long time suddenly became sayable and thinkable in a way that they just hadn't been because of how dominant Henry had been, and how I think the Tudor court must have been a really frightening place to try and live. And I wonder whether some of it was lots of things kept under a pressure valve. And then when Henry dies, people suddenly start saying what they think, maybe what they've been thinking for quite a long time, things that they've been, so in the 1540s, Cranmer had clearly been working on some English liturgy. None of that sees the light of day until after Henry's death.
So there is a sense that, as well as being liked by Henry, Cranmer was prudent.
Yeah. You could call it being prudent, you could call it time serving, you could call it being cowardly, you could call it all kinds of things. But it is one of the things that is hardest to account for about the latter years of the Henrician Church.
Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody else have a hand? Anna.
There.
There you
Thank
are.
you, Hannah. Just trying to unmute myself. Thank you. That was a lovely, lovely talk. I've always been a great lover and studied the Aramaic Jesus,
Mhm.
and done a tour of Israel with scholars at that level. So I'm really interested in, there's a couple of things that popped out from your talk about what was the Protestant church. Are you going to make a leap to go into what is the church now in these talks? Or is that just like another 6 sections on? Because for me, I'm wondering from the Aramaic Jesus and this early beauty that he was, where is Jesus now?
So there's a number of things that, I mean, I think that, thank you. And I think one of the things that thinking historically and thinking with our history can help us do is to think currently too. And there's a lovely little collection of essays by Rowan Williams called Why Study the Past, which were based on a series of, I think, Lent lectures he gave at Salisbury quite a long time ago now. But one of the things that Rowan Williams argues in that is that good theology doesn't come from bad history. And I think one of the things that us coming back and back to this question about what sort of church was the church on the eve of the Reformation, was the church under Henry, was the church under Elizabeth, was the church under, for example, Charles I, coming back to that question. And, I mean, Daniel is far better, qualified than I to comment about what sort of church was the Victorian church. What that does is it helps us to think about what sort of church do we inhabit now, and what sort of how does what we do or don't do express what we believe or prioritize or think is fundamental. So whilst the purpose of these talks is primarily to explore historically, I think I would certainly hope that thinking with our Reformation forebears, if you like, would help us think with the current church, Church of England, Anglican Communion, perhaps think more widely about, where do we think we sit in all of this? And how does that relate to the texts of scripture, to the historic creeds, to all the stuff that we receive? Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, it does. And, I'm glad you have just said that, because it's I'm feeling this huge arc of time from the inception of Jesus and where we are now. And that's really the reason why I'm here, just loving to have some history, some more current history, so to speak. And I didn't come last week because I was at the cathedral.
Hearing some patristic stuff, I think.
Yeah.
Very technical.
That's probably quite a. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I think
Charlotte's
Charlotte's
got her
got a
hand
question there. Sorry, Charlotte.
Yeah. Could I just ask one more? Could you clarify one more thing for me? And that's this anointing, this sacred anointing. Did it come with Henry then through the lineage of the kings? Because, I've got this image of Queen Elizabeth, when we first, she was taken into the sacred place and we didn't see. And now we're going to have our next king crowned. Did that start with Henry? Could
no,
you
it's older than that. It's older than that.
But through the kings, I meant.
No, it's older than that. Medieval monarchs were anointed in England as well, and presumably elsewhere in Europe. I don't know much about other European coronation rites. Does anybody? somebody else might. It's an interesting question. But no, it's been part of English coronation practice for much longer than that.
Okay, thank you.
Charlotte.
Yeah,
And then
I was just wondering if it was helpful to Anna's question. When the Book of Homilies was produced or was published,
yeah,
does, not that I've read any of them, but all those
yeah.
all those sermons, would they give a clear view as to how we, or they thought of Jesus, the New Testament and indeed God in the Old Testament? I'm not familiar with the Book of Homilies. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are listening, are familiar with that, but that might help how Jesus sort of was perceived at that time. Perhaps.
It might. I mean, we can certainly pick up about the homilies, because the first set are broadly Cranmer's work, they're 1547. The second set are later, and then the two books of homilies are authorised at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign. I think it's important with the homilies and things, and cognate, related texts, of which there become many authorised in the Church of England. They're answering the theological questions that were being asked in the context of the 16th century Reformation debates, and they're not necessarily always the same theological questions that we're asking. So whilst they can tell us, I mean, for instance, nobody much in the mainstream Reformation was questioning sort of Chalcedonian orthodoxy or all of those sorts of patristic understanding of the church. They do get called into question by Reformation radicals, for sure. But primarily the sorts of questions people are asking are things like, how am I saved? What happens at the Eucharist? Small questions like that. But it's certainly we can come back to the homilies, and they might cast some lights in some different angles on some of those questions. So thank you, that's really helpful.
Great, Hannah. I think we might, as we approach 15:15,
Yes.
we might pause there, but that was a masterly overview of a complex period in the English Reformation, hugely look forward, and lays the ground very well, I think, for next week, and for Edward and for Mary Tudor. So we look forward to seeing you everyone at the same time, 7 o'clock next Thursday.
7 o'clock next Thursday. We're only doing 10 years next week, so
Okay.
short and fat next week.
Great. We look forward
Thank
to it. In the meantime, everyone, have a good week. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.